So we're here at the Gemara on Daf Lamed Amud Aleph, and Rava is offering various options of shinui to carry all this weight. And he says that if the normal way of carrying on a chol, on a weekday, would be baragla, then lidru be'agra. Right, so you have these two people holding on their shoulders as they face each other to a long pole. And what they do is they put on this pole the weight of all these barrels that are attached, and that's the way they're going to transport it. Didaru, if during the weekday the agra, they transport it by carrying it by agra with this long pole that's carried by two people on their shoulders, then lidru bi achpa. And in order to make a shinui, what they should do is, instead of keeping that long pole on their shoulders, they should hold it in their hands. And even though that doesn't make it easier, but it doesn't make it more difficult. And it's a shinu. So we've gone down one madrega in the sense that we can no longer improve and minimize the tircha, but on the other hand, we still maintain a shinu. Now, to Darbi Achpa, if on a weekday they would carry it in their hands, the two sides of this long pole, then on Yontif, Nifros Sudara Iluya, in order to make a shinui, they should cover the barrel with a sudar, with some sort of a cloth. And that would at least conceal that which they're carrying. And that itself is a shinui, because normally they didn't have to conceal it. And it doesn't add any element of tircha, of more sweat and toil, because the cloth, which they use to cover it, doesn't have any weight to it. The imlo efshar, now we go back to the brisa that we began with. Rava is now going to invoke the halacha of the brisa that if there's no possibility of doing a peshinu, and you will not be able to transport this food that you need on Yontif, shari, then we're allowed to do it without even covering it, without changing. To Yomar Mar, as we saw earlier in the brisa, the efshal shanos mutter. If there's no other way that's possible, it's feasible to carry without putting the weight of the barrels into a sal or a kupa that we discussed earlier, then you're allowed to carry it besal. With kupa, the same thing applies. In Rava's context, in Mechoza, if it's impossible to make a shinui and cover it with a sudar, then you're allowed to do it even without a shinui and carry it and transport it. Amalei Rav Chanan bar Rava l'Ravashi. Amar Rabbanon, the Chachamim said with regard to carrying weight on Yontif, we should try to maximize the ability, the shinui element, and change it as much as possible on Yontif. So it's nikar, it's clear to everyone that he's not doing it the same way he would do it on a weekday. So the Gemara asks the following kasha. What about our Vibelach, our women folk, the Kamalian, when they fill up chatzbayu are their kadim, their various kalim for water carrying. How do you say kad in English? A pitcher, excellent. When they carry their pitchers at home, lo kamishanina, they go out to the river, they fill it up, and they carry it in without any shina. They do it exactly the same way. They transport the water in the pitchers the same way they do it during the week. And nobody said a word to them. Nobody protested. Amalei, so Rav Ashi responds to Rav Chanan, and he says, Mishum de lo efshar. I'm going to show you, I'm going to prove to you that there's no option of making a shina. Let's go through a myriad of possible options, and we'll reject each one of them. Hechi what do you want them to do? Demalia b'chatzba rabba, maybe for Yontif they should use larger pitchers and transport larger volumes of water at a time. Tamali b'chatzba zuta. If during the week they use larger pitchers, and on Yontif they should use smaller pitchers, and then we'll have the reverse. Is then kamafsha b'lucha. You have another variable here in the equation, because if they use smaller pitchers, you're going to force them to go back and forth and back and forth. You're expanding the tircha. And we don't want to be marba tircha on Yontif. Now, if it's the other way around, if during the week they use smaller pitchers, now on Yontif we're going to require them for Shinui to use larger pitchers called Mafshi Masli. Then they're carrying larger weight. And once again, we don't want to be marbe to increase the weight on Yontif. Maybe we should at least require of them to cover these pitchers with some sort of a wooden covering. No, we can't allow that either. Why? Because Zimnin did nafal. Those wooden coverings are valuable. It might fall because there's nothing plastering them down to the kadim. They're only temporary. And if a wind comes, it'll blow away. And they're going to go ahead and pick up these coverings and be metaltal in B'Rishus Rab. And even though it's Litzorech Ochel Nefesh and it's Yontif, but nevertheless, to save the covering is not Litzorech Ochel Nefesh. And that's prohibited, albeit midrabanan on Yontif. So you don't want them to come and carry something which they don't have to carry on Yontif, B'Rishus Rab. And by the way, this Gemara could have relevance to those who take their Machzorim to Shul on Yontif, and there's no Eruv, that maybe you're allowed to do that, but because you're going to use the Machzor on Yontif to daven with, but just to carry different things, on Yontif and Rosh Hashanah, I'm not sure if that's mutter. Anyway, the Gemara offers another option, Tiktere. Why not take these coverings and on Erev Yontif tie them down with knots to these kadim, to these pitchers, in such a way they won't fall? The Gemara answers Zimnin de Mifsak, because no matter how hard and tightly you tie them, they may get loose. Mifsak, it may get loose. And what is he going to do? She's going to retie the knots, and that's a violation of Meleches Kosher. All right, but at least Tufra Sudra Le. Why don't we just at least take a covering and put it on top of the pitchers? The minimum shinui. More answer Zimnin de Mitmich, because it might get wet. If you take a cloth and put it on these pitchers that are full with water, they might get wet with Maya. And then she may inadvertently start squeezing out the water from this sudar, from this cloth. And that would be a violation of Meleches Schita. Ilkach lo efshar, therefore there's no other way of doing it. And as we said before, if it's the efshar, you can't make a shinui, then you're allowed to carry it that way. But now the Gemara is going to say, wait a minute, your issue is, should we protest against those who seem to violate the din? Amalei Rava Barav Chanim Labai Tnan. We have a Mishnah later on. A metafkin, we're not allowed to clap. V'ain masafkin, or to bang with one's palm on his thigh. V'ain maraktin, and we're not allowed to dance on Yontif. And all the above were prohibited midrabanan because we were choshesh that maybe they would make a kli shir. When they get too involved in the simcha, or they used to also play some instruments of sadness during Avelus, they may get carried away and they may create a kli shir. And yet, Rava says in our time, it's widespread practice, the kochazin and the they dance and they sing and they clap. We don't complain, we don't make a protest. Why? Amalei Sabai says to Rav Chanin, and according to your logic that you asked this question about how and why we're not objecting to all these clappings and dancings and so forth, you should have asked me a different question. Al Hadi Omar, Rabba, it should be the Girsa, should be Rabba. Lo Leisev Inish Afuma Delechio. A person, when he sets up a heter mavui. Now, a mavui is surrounded on three sides by mechitzos. That makes it into a reshus hayachid. And right outside the mavui is a reshus harabim, is a public area. And a person, says Rabbah, is not allowed to sit on the opening of the mavui where the lechi was set up. The lechi is the vertical pole that allows you to carry from a chutzah into a mavui. But it's very difficult to know exactly where the mavui ends and where Rishus HaRabim begins. And therefore, if a person will sit right there at that point, then Dilma Megandra Le Chayfetz, maybe some object that he's holding on to will fall out of his hands, and it'll go beyond the Lechi into Rishus HaRabim. He's standing in the Mavui. He's going to bring it back into the Mavui. And the Mavui, we said, has the status of Rishus HaYachid. He will violate a Malach Doraisa of Havara from Rishus HaRabim into Rishus HaYachid. And Abai asks, Vahani Noshi, we know that the women, Shaklin Chatzai, when they come in with their pitchers full of water from the river, Aslan, the Yasmin Afuma de Mavah. They actually sit down, maybe they take a rest there at the Petach HaMavu. They are violating Gzeres Chachamim, and nobody makes a big deal about it. Ella, but rather, the whole question is not a question because we have a principle called Hanachlam Yisrael, Mutav Shogig and V'ayu Mezid. That in a case, we'll see soon, it's only a violation of a Gzeres Drakonim, but in a case where people and the masses of people got used to a certain behavior pattern and they think that it's allowed, it's permitted, better not to tell them anything so that they remain shogeg, because if you tell them, they're so used to doing it the way they do it, now they'll have a status of amazing. And therefore, that's going to be the same answer to your question about why we don't protest against their dancing and singing and clapping and jumping and all this. Because Hachinami here too, Hanachlam Yisrael, Mutav Shogeg, V'ayu Mezid. They're so used to doing this on Yantu that we're not going to gain anything. On the contrary, we're going to lose a lot by protesting. However, the Gemara qualifies Hanivili be D'Rabbanan. That only applies in a case where the masses are violating an Issa D'Rabbanan, like Rikud and Tipuach or Yeshiva B'Pesach HaMavui. These are all Gzeres D'Rabbanan. D'Oraisa, we're going to prove in a minute that if there's a matter of violating a Din Torah, then we have to make a protest. And we have to believe that they'll accept that protest and they'll change their ways. So the Gemara says, what would be a case of a Doraisa where people are violating a Doraisa? We have to protest. Beloi, is it true that there's a difference between a Doraisa and a Doraisa Loshon of the Doraisa Loshon of the Rabbanon? Lo Amridu Lo Midi, that I'm going to prove to you that even in a case of a Doraisa, we're not going to protest. The Gemara Masechet Yom at the end of the Masechet derives from a pasuk. It says, why does it say B'Tish'a on the 9th of Tishrei? And that teaches us that we're obligated on a Doraisa level to add from Chol and make it into Kodesh. And yet, we see that people, maybe women, people in general, are eating and drinking until it actually gets dark, until darkness sets in. They don't begin the fast when it's still Mibod Yom, when there's still light out, and fulfill the requirement of B'Tisha of Tosefes Yom Kippur, V'lo Amridu Lo Midi. So here's a case where clearly we don't object, even though it's a violation of the Doraisa. And the Gemara therefore concludes that the principle of Hanachlam Yisrael and Mutav Shogeg V'ayu Mezidim applies even in a case of a Doraisa. However, we should know that the Ritva and Shita Mekubetzes and others point out that this only applies in a case of a Doraisa that's derived from a drasha. But if you have a Doraisa that's explicit in the Torah, then even according to the Maskana of the Gemara, we will have to make a protest and assume that they'll accept the protest. He says in our generation where people are violating various isurim and they're being lenient when they shouldn't be, it's appropriate to create a siyag l'Torah even for an isur d'Rabbanan. And we should make a macha, and we should institute punitive measures until they do tshuva. The Mishnah says, "Maschilin ba'remas hateven." If you have a stack of straw. Sorry, I always forget that word straw. I don't know why. Anyway, you have a stack of straw, then you're allowed to take out from the straw, even though it wasn't prepared specifically for burning, but you're allowed to use it for a sukkah. So Gemara now presents a contradiction between the Reisha and the Seifa of our Mishnah. Amar Rav Kahana, Soso Meres, from the Mishnah itself, we can derive the conclusion that maschilin bi otzar tchila, that you're allowed to take from an otzar, that which was put away in storage, and use it, even though it was put in long-term storage, you're allowed to use it on Yom Tov. And it wasn't prepared mibod yom. What happened to muktzah? Mani, our Mishnah must reflect the Shita Rabbi Shimon, the Leslie Muktzah, Rabbi Shimon who rejects Muktzah. But Ema Sefer, let's read the Sefer of that Mishnah. It says, Avolo the Eitzim Sheba Muktzah. You have wood in the back of your yard, and you're not allowed to use that on Yom Tov because that's called Muktzah. Zasan, that reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, the Islay Muktzah. So how do we reconcile the Reish and the Sefer? So the first answer to the Gemara is that the Mishnah really reflects the Shita Rabbi Shimon, who rejects Muktzah, but Hacha and the Sefer, in the case of those Eitzim that were Muktzah because they were back there in storage in the backyard, that Isur is not based on Muktzah, but rather, it's not based on that muktzah, which is the subject of a debate between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon, but rather a category of muktzah that even Rabbi Shimon accepts, and that's the Arze Vashuche Askina. These are very expensive cedar trees, and they are designated for building purposes, for construction, and that's called muktzah machmas isaron kis. It's muktzah because you set it aside. You don't want to lose something that's expensive. And afilu Rav Shimon Modeh, even Rav Shimon agrees that if you have something that's very expensive, these unusual expensive trees that are designated exclusively for building purposes, that would be muktzah. But in the case of aremas teven, if you're talking about straw is cheap, then Rabbi Shimon holds there's no isur muktzah, therefore you could begin to take from this arema, this pile of straw, and you can use it on Yom Tov. However, now the Gemara has an alternative tradition. Ika demasni le as-seifa. Some say that the diuk of Rav Kana began with the seifa of Mishnah. In our Mishnah, in the seifa, it says, "Have a low b'eitzim shabamuk." So you can't use those eitzim that are in the backyard. Rav Kana so meres. We can learn from this statement of the Tana that ein maschilin bi'otza tchila, that when a person puts logs into storage, that makes it muktzah. Mani, and that reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, the Islay muktzah. Ema Reisha, what are we going to do at the beginning of the Mishnah? The Mishnah says maschilin ba'aremas hateven. We're allowed to take from the stalks, the stacks of straw, and he really put them away, and he piled them up. He didn't prepare them in both Yom. Asan the Rabbi Shimon, the Leslie Muktzah. How do we reconcile that? So Gemara says now, you know what? This Mishnah reflects the Shita Rabbi Yehuda, and he accepts Muktzah Hasam in the Reisha. Why were they matir? Why was the Tana lenient to begin Hishtamshus in Aremas Teven? B'tivna sarya. This was straw that was already rotting, and it had a bad odor to it, and it's not something that could even feed your animals. And therefore, the only thing you could possibly do with it is burn it, not feed it to the animals. And therefore, he's not going to lock it up in storage for a long term. He's going to use it immediately for combustion. And in this case, even Rabbi Yehuda would concede that even if he didn't explicitly and expressly prepare it before Yom Tov for the purpose of hasaka to burn it, even though he didn't say that explicitly, but nevertheless he's allowed to do it because that's what you do with straw. Once it becomes rotten, then you cannot feed it to the animals. The Gemara says, but tivnes sarya, a chazina latina. Don't tell me that the only thing that you can do with this rotten straw is use it as firewood. You could do something else with it. You could prepare it for concrete and make bricks out of it. Even if it's, pardon the expression, fashtunkin, you could still use it to make bricks out of it. And the Gemara answers this by kotzim, that we're talking about a case where this straw has thorns in it, and it's impossible to knead it together with his hands or his feet because it's so dangerous, and therefore he can't make concrete out of it and make bricks out of it. Therefore, the only thing it's fit for is for combustion in order to burn it and in his fire.